What follows is the second part of Lecture 4, in which we'll look at some of the very scant evidence that we have for landscape painting of the Tang period. Most of it is lost. We still have to deal, for the most part, with fragments and copies, and a few paintings that we can take to be maybe Tang, but a very uncertain reliability. But even these give us some sense of what was happening in the landscape, a very important development of the landscape in this period. We can read about it in writings of the time. We know that there were, for the first time, artists who devoted themselves to landscape. Not the leading masters of the time who were figure painters, but at least landscape, as I say, was becoming established as a separate genre of painting. Still secondary to figure painting and to Buddhist painting, but having some importance, absorbing the energies of a few major masters, being the principal concern of a few of them. Well, something approaching what we call pure landscape was already around before the Tang. If we remember in the Six Dynasties, the essay of Ming, who talked about painting landscape. So there was a landscape painting, but we don't have much evidence for what it looked like. But in the Tang, it really develops in important ways, as we'll see. Okay, now on to the paintings. Now, here we have, in the first slide, a drawing based on a wall painting in the tomb of a certain Prince Ida. Prince Ida was another of those early Tang members of the Imperial family who were put to death by the Empress, the wicked Empress Wu Zetian, as I talked about in the last part of the early part of this lecture. And others were the Princess Yongtai and Prince Zhanghuai. This is a third of them, named Prince Ida. And it's, again, a painting done on the walls of the ramp leading down into the tomb, which is why it has a diagonal base. Big paintings on both sides of the ramp, and each of them having the same composition. What we're seeing here is some kind of ceremony in which troops are massed, pulled up outside the walls of Chang'an, and at the right you see the city gates, presumably, and part of the wall. And then behind them, up above the troops, you see a rocky landscape. And it's the rocky landscape that I'm really going to be talking about, and it's really to the point for our purpose. The next, please, here we go. This must be from the other side, the gates, facing in the opposite direction. Bob Thorpe, in the Thorpe and Vinograd book, page 189, reproduces this picture, which is a reconstruction of a Tang palace with towers at the corners that resemble this wall painting, or the towers in this wall painting. And it may be the very place, so maybe I should call them corner towers of a palace building rather than gate towers. Anyway, this picture of the gates is, of course, of interest to architectural historians of China, not so much to art historians, although to us too. But at any rate, it has a very clear depiction of the architecture of these gates and the tops of the gates, sort of temple-like architecture. One interesting thing about these is that you are looking up under the eaves and looking down on the lower part of that gate structure, the railings and so on, as if, that is, the artist were using something like single-point perspective, with the receding lines converging and so on. It obviously isn't true to real perspective. It's artificial, and yet it has that effect. Interesting also is the fact that we're looking up under the eaves. Now, that's an issue of interest to architectural historians again. There was a writer in the 11th century named Shen Gua, quite famous and rightly so. He's quoted quite a lot in the book by Susan Bush and Shou Yan Shi, called the Early Chinese Text on Painting. On page 112 of that book, you find a passage by Shen Gua having to do with this matter of looking up under the eaves. He criticizes people who have praised the artist Li Cheng, a 10th century artist to look at later. People praise Li Cheng for drawing the architecture in his paintings so that you see up under the eaves. Sungwa says this is wrong. He's not criticizing Li Cheng so much as those who praise this feature, because Sungua's point really is that you cannot paint as though from a particular viewpoint. That is, as if you were locating your viewer in a particular point and showing everything from that point of view. This is quite wrong, as he points out, because if you did that, you would have a lot of overlapping, parts of the landscape overlapping each other, and you wouldn't be able to see things clearly. In other words, he is praising the old Chinese convention, without naming it, of arranging the parts of the picture vertically upward, the up equals back convention, that is, and separating them in space, but which means you are not having a located viewer, as you don't in Chinese painting. You don't paint as though everything in the picture were seen from a particular point of view. Okay, this was a point worth making, even though it's a little peripheral to landscape that I'm talking about. Now, as I say, really what interests us is the landscape elements up above. The next slide, here we go. And now we see, this must be the other side, the gate is on the right now. And the wall curves around or zigzags around and encloses the troops down in the lower part, who are, as I say, drawn up for some kind of ceremony perhaps, carrying banners, mostly red banners. But look at the landscape up above, a rocky landscape with pine trees. Very interestingly, but not often mentioned, is the fact that we actually know the name of the artist who painted this picture. His name, which is written on it, is Chang Bian, and he's recorded as a follower of the much more famous painter Li Shun, and we'll talk about later, an early Tang painter who specialized in landscapes with blue and green color. Now, this identification that Chang Bian is a known artist, and his name is on this painting. This was made, as I recall, in a catalog by Jan Fontaine of an exhibition he organized of copies of Tang wall paintings while he was curator at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. This is some decades old, but still a fine catalog, and I credit Jan Fontaine with noticing, as nobody else I know had, that this is actually a painting of whom we know the artist. And that's quite rare for wall paintings, tomb wall paintings especially. Here now you see the detail of the landscape. And what I want to point out, well, two things really. It's a line and color method of landscape. That is, you have heavy outlining, and as I've pointed out on other connections, the line drawing in wall paintings has to be relatively heavy in order to work as it should, to be seen from a distance by people below. And the other thing, you have color added to this linear structure, shaded blue and green color, heavy mineral color. And as I say, his teacher, Chang Bian's teacher, Li Shun, was a specialist in linear landscape with heavy color. And the other thing, and what's most important for my purpose, is that, as you see, the rocks are drawn in a kind of blocky way, as you learn as a child how to draw a box, showing three sides, with angles, right angles most often, and the sides of the rock shown, so that it has real volume. Now, this is very important indeed, because it suggests that within this blue and green style, of which we'll see a fine example a little later, the Emperor Ming Huang's Journey to Shu is called. Within this style, the original Tang artists may well have drawn their rocky masses in such a way as to indicate volume by using this old technique, old for us, of showing the sides and having angles, sharp angles, and painting them like boxes or blocks. Okay, enough for that. This is another detail showing more of these blocky, volumetrically drawn rocks. I should have pointed out earlier that we're not seeing slides or images made from the original painting here, but from a copy. We didn't have access to the original. The next, please. But The same feature of style, that is the drawing of rocks as three-sided block-like forms, can be seen in other original Tang designs. Here, a stone engraving in one of the imperial tombs. I think Princess Yongtai's, but I'm not sure. Anyway, it's the same kind. It's just what we see is some kind of rocky knoll or outcropping with grass growing from it. I would guess, in other words, that when we see a landscape like the Emperor Ming Huang's Journey to Shu, as we will in a little bit, which is a copy after a Tang painting, if we knew the original might be more like this. In other words, have blocky, rocky masses instead of the flat ones as they are now. In other words, the copyists failed to transmit this feature of the original. Okay, going on now. Now getting on with another genuine example of Tang landscape. This is a plectrum guard on a biwa or lute in the Shoso-in. This is an actual old Chinese pipa or lute. You can see where the plectrum guard was located on the Shoso-in example under the strings. Now the Shoso-in I talked about last time briefly is the great imperial treasury from 8th century Japan, in which things owned by the emperor were put for storage after his death, and they've been there ever since. And a great many of them, many of the important pieces, are believed to be Chinese. This is an example. He had many treasures from China that were put there after his death. Now the lute, biwa, or pipa in Chinese, is an instrument that indeed came from Western Asia. I'll speak a bit about the Western Asian people in this picture. And I should, by the way, I recommend books. And another book I can recommend very highly is a book that has to do with imported elements in Tang culture. That is, elements that came from far away from China. And this is a book by Edward Schaefer. Ed Schaefer, who was one of my teachers, and my great teachers. And his book is titled The Golden Peaches of Samarkand, an ancient city in Uzbekistan in Western Asia. So I'll recommend that one very highly to you, The Golden Pieces of Samarkand by Edward Schaefer. Okay, now we're looking, as I say, at a lute, and here you see the whole thing with its strings and so on. Now, next please. Here is a slide of the painting only, without the strings. Again, I have to use slides from reproductions. I certainly don't have originals. Nobody is allowed to make slides in the Shoso-in. I actually was in the Shoso-in way back when people were allowed once a year to enter the Shoso-in and look around. I don't think that's done anymore. Now they have big exhibitions in the museum instead. At any rate, I was there, but I don't remember whether I saw this. And it cannot be as well viewed in any case as you can with good reproductions like this. Now, it's a landscape with figures. In the foreground is an elephant, as you see, with people on it. And the people are a group of musicians, dancer and musicians, coming across Asia, presumably, from Persia, anyway, wherever, Western Asia. I'll have a detail of them later. And then behind them is a landscape, and that's what's very important for our purpose, because it's a very fine landscape that takes us back into distance to bluffs, one on each side, done in what would be ink-monochrome if it were a proper painting. Here, this is done on some kind of more permanent pigment on a leather plectrum. So it's not exactly ink-monochrome, but it's as if it were ink-monochrome. Now the next, please. Here are the musicians on the elephant. As many of you know, there is a tomb figurine that was found back in the 1950s, I remember, excavated, and much reproduced and very popular, which is exactly this subject. In other words, an elephant, and on the back of it, on a platform, a whole orchestra of figures. Apparently this was a real sight that could be seen in the streets of Chang'an. There's a flutist and a little boy with a cap dancing, and another man, obviously a foreigner, big nose, big mustache, funny cap, on the elephant. So this is the foreign element which is exotic and exciting for the Chinese. But for our purpose, what is interesting is the background behind. And here, next slide, is the background in a black and white slide that shows it more clearly. As you see, there are tall bluffs on each side, flat-topped, with what in ink monochrome would be line and some kind of wash or rough strokes of ink to shade from each of the folds to the next. And they are treated with vertical parallel folds. Now, the idea of building a landscape mass out of parallel forms, lines, we saw already as early as the landscape, the mountain, in the admonition scroll attributed to Gukager. And here it is again, and we'll see it over and over, because it reproduces the real effect of some landscape in northern China especially. So, okay, but then you also see a river valley with a river winding through it, and then winding still further into the distance, a flight of geese. That again we saw in one of the Sichuan tiles in the late Han Dynasty, in which the geese were first seen on the water and then taking off and then flying off into the distance. Much more distant here, of course. And that's exactly what they're doing, going into the far distance. And then in the far distance you see distant hills or mountains, and then a sunset beyond that. All right, a very fine landscape, and one can again imagine an ink monochrome painting behind this. Diminution used very effectively. Large trees in the foreground or just behind the elephant, and then smaller trees further on, still smaller and still smaller, going way into the distance. Okay, very effectively drawing the viewer back into the far distance. Okay, there's also, in this period, as you can see, with the sunset and so on, that Tang artists seem to have been interested in things like weather and time of day in their landscapes. We know this also from written records. Okay, another feature of Tang landscape. Now then, next please. This is a very famous painting, and it's loosely associated with two artists, actually, of the early Tang, named Li Sishun and his son Li Jiaodao, the two Lis. They're sometimes called in China, in Chinese writings. Li Sishun, 651 to 716, and his son Li Jiaodao, circa AD 675 to 741. In other words, 7th into early 8th century artists. There were more conservative landscapists of their time, major conservative landscapists, I mean. They served in the court as court artists. And a famous anecdote, Li Sishun is set against the great Wu Daozi, whom I talked about in the previous part of this lecture, a bit anachronistically, more than a bit, in fact. In fact, the two could not have coexisted at all, because Wu Daozi is well up into the 8th century, and Li Sishun is back in the 7th. But in this story, which is told in a later Tang text, 9th century book, both of them are commanded by the emperor to paint the scenery of a certain place in Sichuan, southwest China, on the palace walls after making a trip there. And when they return, Li Sishun spends several months completing his painting, but Wu Daozi does his painting in a single day. And the emperor of the time pronounces both to have attained the height of excellence, as he says. So, in other words, the painstaking style, as you see here, and the quicker and sketchier style, as Wu Daozi is supposed to have done it, or actually did do it apparently, from text, coexisted in the Tang Dynasty, and both were appreciated. So we have a very wide range of possible ways of rendering landscape. The two Lis, to whom this painting is loosely associated with whom, seem to have codified a type of landscape that had been developing for centuries before. We saw an earlier form of it actually in the Nymph of the Law River scrolls, that is, line and color, line and heavy blue-green color. Codifying this into a classical style, which is called blue-green or green and gold, using heavy mineral pigments, outlining the forms, very heavy and decorative values, spreading a decorative beauty, decorative surface over the whole painting, making one wander over the painting, absorbing this, 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 and this, instead of trying to unify the landscape and the effect of the landscape. Now, this is much practiced by certain later artists, conservative artists, often court artists, but always as an archaistic manner of landscape. For the later periods, this is very definitely archaistic. That is to say, imitating the distant past. Up-to-date styles are going in very different directions, as we'll see, in the direction of ink-monochrome and unifying the landscape and unified space and all kinds of things we don't see here. Now, so Li Shishun and Li Jiaodao, the father and son of the early Tang, are named later as the founders of the so-called Northern School of Painting. In the 17th century, an artist critic named Dong Qichang, very famous, great man, manufactured, thought up a kind of quasi-art historical history of painting in which there were two great schools or currents. The Southern School, that of the scholar amateur artists, beginning with Wong, whom we'll talk about later, a Tang painter, and the Northern School, beginning with the two Lis, continuing on through the academic and so-called artisan painters, professional painters. Well, that's out of our subject, but it's still important that Li Shishun and Li Jiaodao are seen that way. Now, the painting before us, very famous, as I say, is titled Emperor Ming Huang's Flight to Shu, or Emperor Ming Huang's Journey to Shu sometimes. And as I say, it was loosely attributed to Li Jiaodao, but probably both of the Lis were dead by the time of the event that it presumably depicts, that is, the flight of the Emperor Xuanzong down into Sichuan from the rebellion, the Anlushan rebellion in Chang'an. So it's actually by some follower of theirs, the original is, that is. And this is probably a Sung copy. I would guess that it is something like 11th century. Anyway, maybe early Sung. My friend, colleague, Li, wrote a long article naming, dating it to the early Sung. Actually, the first great gathering of Chinese painting specialists, in 1962, something I organized as a post-mortem conference, I called it, on the Chinese Art Treasures exhibition held in New York. We put various paintings on the screen and asked people to comment on them, and this was the first that I put up on the screen, and the two first speakers dated it exactly a millennium apart, 1,000 years apart. This is really very disturbing. Max Lohr called it 8th century. He took it to be a Tang original. And Alexander Soper, another great authority, dated it to the 18th century. Well, Soper dating is much too late. I don't know why he thought that. Soper was not a great specialist in painting exactly. He did a lot of work in other matters, sculpture and architecture and so on, Buddhist art. And Lohr was always too believing, too credulous about the dating and attribution of paintings. But it was very disturbing to have these two great specialists dating the painting 1,000 years apart. Anyway, here's the whole of this very famous painting in the Palace Museum in Taiwan, Taipei, National Palace Museum. And I'll show a series of slides to show what the parts of the painting look like, and also the narrative effect of it. Let me mention, first of all, as you see, the nearest point in the painting at the bottom is already quite far from the viewer. The figures are small, the bridges and so on that you see are small. The painting is more or less symmetrical in that you have a central mass and then spaces with the bridges down below and streams flowing into the foreground, or into the background, I guess it is, more into the river, which you see in the distance. And then you have the two side pieces with figures coming in on one side and going out on the other. We'll see details of that. And most of all, you have the landscape itself done in this linear blue and green style. Okay, let's go on now and begin seeing the details. I think we can bring back the whole from time to time to show how it works. But at any rate, here we go. A series of details. Starting in the upper right, here you see how the landscape elements are drawn. That is, they're drawn in outline, continuous, even line generally, and heavy color, blue and green color. And the clouds are drawn as hard-edged clouds, no real atmosphere in this painting yet. That's something for the future. As I said, we might be able to kind of reconstruct this in our minds and think of rocky forms that were much more volumetric, much more blocky, like the ones in the wall painting that I started with. But that's just imagination. And here in the ravine here, seen between the cliffs, are two horsemen. In other words, the party that you see emerging down below goes back, includes other figures who are seen still here way up above in the ravine. Okay, the next slide, please. Here, down in the lower right, this is the passage that is often reproduced. I have the two details from this in my scarab book. This is one of them. Presumably, it's if we believe the reputed title or subject of this painting, this is the Emperor Ming Xuanzong, making his way into exile, temporary exile in Sichuan, and accompanied by his retinue, his entourage, camels laden with heavy loads, his accompanies, the officials who are accompanying him, and palace ladies seen behind on horses, and coming through the ravine behind. Okay, they were emerging into the foreground, in other words, from further back. And they're surrounded with quite lovely trees, variegated different kinds of trees and so on, distinguished by different foliage. We've seen this already, and leaves much larger than natural and such. Now the next slide, close up. Here is the emperor, presumably, red coat on his horse. You see the horse's mane is tied into 3 tufts. This is something we can read about in old text. That's a matter of interest to horse lovers. I forget just what the history of that was. At any rate, very fine line and color drawing. A picture that you read part by part, come to understand by sort of additively, by looking at one part after another. If you look at the rocks over on the, let's say, the middle left side, concentrating on those for a moment, much of the line drawing is of a type that came to be called nail-head rat-tailed lines, and you see why. At the beginning of each stroke, you can have, not always, but in many of them, a kind of thickening like a nail head, and then they trail off at the other end like a rat tail. Leyland Song it was. I tried to think of the name earlier. My friend who wrote a long article on this published it and dated it to around the 11th century and looked at various features of the style and tried to date them from texts and from other paintings. This is one of his points about the nail-head rat-tail lines. The next. Then, now looking back into the distance from on the right side, we see the river beyond the foreground, all the subject of the painting, and the distant hills being more and more drawn in finer, thinner line, something we saw already back in the Han Dynasty in our second lecture in a painting, the famous flying garment painting. At any rate, and the color dimmer and clouds and so on, taking us back into the far distance in a way that's effective, not nearly as effective as it later will be when artists develop the technique of atmospheric perspective and further things become dimmer and are hard to see and so on. Well, up at the top is the lower part of the inscription by the Emperor Qianlong, 18th century emperor, who, as I mentioned last time, wrote more than he should have on his paintings, and his inscriptions are generally not much appreciated. The next, please. Then down in the middle foreground after we crossed one of the bridges from the right section into the middle section. Here is a group of maybe merchants, it's hard to say, who have stopped to rest, and their horses and mules and one camel are resting. The mule is rolling over, as you see. They've unloaded their these large loads of whatever it is they're carrying on them, and they're sitting around relaxing under the trees. So it's a bit of sort of anecdotal material. So the picture also is three-part in the sense that it can be seen as entering, resting, and going out here. And again, you see all the different kinds of trees, pine trees and other. And again, you see the drawing of the rocks and cliffs in line and color in the rushing stream. Okay, next please. Here's a detail of the figures just to show they are drawn too in fine line and color. Very, well, it's a picture that you could call anecdotal if you want to, in that you could write all sorts of stories about what is happening in it. And again, you see in the rock here at the middle right, this nail-head, rat-tailed line, this kind of drawing. And the activity of the camel and the rolling mule and the figures and so on all make a very entertaining kind of painting. And a painting with details, the saddles, things like that are carefully drawn so you can learn something from the painting. The next, please. Then, up above this part, in the center, we see this passage of the central mountains, nearer mountains down below and further mountains above, the trees diminishing in size to achieve some sense of distance, and the clouds hard-edged, but not much real sense of space or distance. All of that comes later, but also all of that is a little antithetical to the blue and green style, which is not given to space and reproducing real optical experience in any way. That's something that comes later and is done very differently by later painters. In other words, this blue and green style and this whole manner is going to be, in the end, rejected by many of the great landscapists of the time as not really conducive to the kind of effects that they wanted to achieve. They thought it was beautiful and everything, but really rather childish and fairy tale-like, you might say. Now here, the left side of the painting, next slide, with the ravine between the two, the middle section and the left section. And again, a bridge down here in the lower right, going across a stream which flows into the distance and into the river, which you see in the far away. And here on the left, making their way from the foreground into the distance, is another party. Presumably it's one party, or maybe a series of different travelers. At any rate, people, mounted travelers with hats and with loads and so on. Now, the road to Shu, the road to down into Sichuan, down into the southwest, was very famous for being a very difficult road. In places, the road had to be built out from the cliffs on beams, wooden beams. There's a famous poem by Li Bai, if you will, great poet of the time, called the difficult road to Shu, something like that. And he describes exactly this, how the troubles you have making your way along this road. So this is part of the rigors and difficulties of the emperor's journey as you see it, as you saw it. Now here in the, let me see now, the next please. Yeah, here close up is the passage in the upper left where you see the road actually built out, supported by timbers around the cliffs. Are very dangerous because it could fall away and so on. You can see also here that there's a kind of a sunset effect, not really consistently achieved. It's certainly not a painting that is lit consistently from any point, but here's an effect at least, which may well have been more striking and believable in the original. As I say, the copy only catches some of the qualities of the original. on the underside of this great slanting cliff, which you see in the upper left, and heavy edge cloud and so on. Okay, that's all for that painting. I think it's all I want to say about that painting. A number of other paintings are also ascribed to Li Shishun and Li Jiaodao, but I think they're all later and of really very problematic relationship to these artists, so I'm not really showing those. There's one of them, a painting with pine trees and palace buildings that's reproduced in the 3,000 Years book, figure 58. I don't show that. Also, there are several other versions of this composition, the Emperor Ming Huang's Journey to Shu. Max Lohr reproduces, I think, two of them and takes them much more seriously than I would. I don't take them seriously. I think they're later, much more mannered, and so on. So much for that composition, which is a very important composition for our purpose, because it preserves a lot of a certain kind of Tang landscape painting. Next, please. This I put on a bit apologetically. It represents a line of investigation I never followed up. I meant to, but never did. I offer it to anyone else who wants it. This is actually a painting by Lang Shining, or Giuseppe Castiglione, a Jesuit priest in China in the 18th century, who served in the court. This painting is reproduced as his work. I believe it is. I've never seen it in the original. In, book, Qingdai Gongting Huihua, Qing court painting, something like that. 2 volumes by, anyway, never mind. It's reproduced as his work, and the title of it is Sunrise Over the Sea. Now, this is the title of a very famous painting, recorded painting by Li Shishun. As I remember, this is from memory, and I have to, as I say, be a bit apologetic about this. But it doesn't look like anything that Giuseppe Castiglione is going to do on his own. I think he's copying something. And I would hazard a guess that what Castiglione was copying was some paintings that was then in the Imperial collection, a hand scroll presumably, which somehow transmitted this old design of Li Shishun, ascribed to Li Shishun, with a sunrise actually here in the far distance, and with clouds over the water, and with waves on the water, and with clouds up above. Somehow I can imagine a copy, at least, of a Tang painting that was seen by Castiglione and copied. It's not a common title or a common subject for a painting. It's rather quite uncommon. So I don't think that Castiglione simply thought it out by himself. Nobody has suggested this, as I say, but it's just an idea of mine, which somebody else can follow up. Maybe the Li Shishun copy is still somewhere in the palace or Palace Museum or Liaoning or somewhere. There's still lots of undiscovered old paintings that are not genuine, but still important as copies that need to be worked on. Okay, I go on to a much more important painting. That's just a sort of a personal, whatever, notion of mine. Now here we have a painting attributed to an artist named Zhang Ziqian. Zhang Ziqian actually was active in the Sui dynasty, the short dynasty, which in the early 7th century, late 7th century. I mean, no, 618. No, what am I saying? Anyway, late 6. Anyway, but that preceded the Tang Dynasty. I spoke about it when I spoke of the Tang Sui Dynasty. Actually, this is again a Song copy of an early landscape. Tang may be and conceivably associated with Zhang Ziqian, and it's titled Roaming in Spring, or Travelers in Spring, a spring outing, something like that. Yo Chun to Traveling in Spring. In the first lecture, I showed a slide, by the way, with the then director of the Palace Museum and myself and others in the reception room in the palace, and we were looking at a scroll, and I said it was the Zhang Ziqian, but actually it was obviously a reproduction. He was presenting us with a reproduction scroll. They wouldn't have the original out like that. They wouldn't allow a foreigner to handle it and so on. So I'm just correcting that small point. But anyway, we were able to see the painting and make lots of details, so I can show details of it. It's a painting with it's again something that probably preserves an old composition, and it very definitely belongs to this mode of blue and green, and outlined forms, and hard-edged clouds, and so on. Waves drawn on the water. Lots of things happening in the scroll. A painting that you move around and enjoy part by part. There is a continuous ground plane, you might say, going back into distance, but it's not really carried out all the way. The mountains and trees, you see, also are diminished as you go back, but not systematically, not all the way into depth. They go back for a certain point, and then suddenly, you break up here in the middle, upper middle. You suddenly break and go back to far distant hills and very small trees and so on. So basically, it's mostly foreground, and again, the nearest objects in it, the horsemen and trees down at the bottom of the composition, are quite a long way from us. So it's again a scene viewed from far away. It's kind of symmetrical, although there's some more diagonal emphasis here with the river receding. Two banks of the stream, one obviously much heavier than the other. At any rate, it's like Ming Huang's journey in that it still spreads all the interesting parts of the painting all over, and you look at it part by part. It relies again on heavy color, individual coloring of all the things in it, which, as I say, robs the scene really of any coherence of the kind that later landscapists are going to be trying for, and makes it into a kind of dispersed decorative surface. And this will change in later landscape as artists aim at effects of greater unity. Okay, in other words, it's still a very fine work, although it's still very much an archaic style. Now we'll begin looking at details. The next, please. These are actual slides made from the original, so they're going to be darker and varying in color and so on. Okay, here is the right side of it, more or less, seen in an original slide. As you see, the figures are painted mainly in white, partly that is underdrawing or undercoating, over which there might have been other colors added, which have come off. But they may also have been in white just to make them stand out from the landscape. Some of them are painted in other colors. And it's a landscape that's dotted not only with decorative trees and rocks, but also with architectural bits. A red bridge here, a temple seen in the upper right here, and over to the left of it a villa of some kind, and figures on horseback moving through the landscape, and figures crossing the river in a boat. Okay, the next, please. And here, the passage that takes you back at a distance. That's a big seal of Qing Emperor Zhao Qing on the upper part. Imperial seals tended to be large, as I've said. And you see here this, well, sort of half-hearted attempt at diminution. It works all right, but it's not like it eventually will be. The trees become smaller, but suddenly the trees pretty much keep their size and shape and level of detail into the far middle distance. And then beyond that, suddenly you break and have hills with trees in the far distance. Okay, the next, please. Now closer up. And here you see the mounted figures and travelers, the people enjoying the springtime, the flowering trees, the bridge, the heavy colored rocks, and the architecture, which I'll have details in a bit, the temple and the villa or somebody's residence anyway, and so on. Now here closer up is another passage, and you see the heavy mineral colors that are used on this. Fortunately, it's well preserved. It hasn't deteriorated in the way one of the Law River scrolls had deteriorated because of chemical action with the silk. That happens only sometimes, fortunately. And here the rich color has been pretty well preserved. Here we see what seems to be a shrine of some kind or small temple in the hills with the entrance to it a door open, and then you can look partly into the building, done in red. standing out very strongly in the middle of the landscape. Hard-edged clouds again, as in the Emperor Ming Huang's journey. The next, please. And here, to the left of that, across a bridge, carefully drawn with red railing, and then you see the entrance to what seems to be someone's retirement house, or maybe just anyway, a house and a villa in the hills. And then you have a stream running down and a little waterfall and so on. All full of color, full of life, charmingly drawn, enjoyable. Next. Here, close up, you see what's called the rocks are done. They're not completely outlined. The base of them is usually set in the earth and so on. And you have the convention of repeated outlines going back, carrying the eye back over a earth surface and shading in color from one of these outlines to the next. Fairly heavy outlines, in some cases lighter in others. But at any rate, it's still very much the blue and green style. The next, please. On the other side of the river, waiting for the ferry, here are two figures. Again, one of them in white, one of them in kind of a purple. And flowering trees, bringing out the season again. And another little villa or some kind of architectural thing over here on the far left. Okay, as well as a kind of movement from right to left as you roll, but also movement as you, so to speak, cross the river with the boat and come upon the figures who are waiting for the ferry. Next, please. The last slide, here they're up close. As I say, figures like this are drawn with white just to, sometimes as undercoating, and there would have been painting over this. For instance, the faces of the figures probably would have been drawn, but this comes off with time. And then you can see the dotted colors of the trees. The one on the upper left with red blossoms, the one down below yellow or maybe leaves, and so forth. Anyway, full of beautiful detail, full of decorative detail, and so forth. Still a fine work. Well, all these are qualities that will disappear from landscape in the next few centuries, which has much more serious purposes than entertainment, which is largely what this one gives us. Here on the screen now is a rubbing from ink rubbing from an engraved stone, which is believed to transmit the design of a great master of the Tang Dynasty named Wong. So I'll put this on, leave it on while I talk about Wong, and then talk about it when the time comes. Wong was one of the great poets of the Tang, as many of you know, along with Li Bo and Du Fu and so forth. One of the major ones who was active in the best period of the Tang in the 8th century. Wong dates being 699 to 759. And he established his villa at a place called Wangchuan, south of the capital, Chang'an. He lived through the rebellion, the Anlushan rebellion. He was forced to take office under Anlushan, and he suffered for this after the reestablishment of Tang rule. He painted, among his most famous works were a series of paintings of his Wangchuan villa and its surroundings, which were wall paintings, and then they were copied various times, and eventually by an 11th century painter named Guo Zhongshu, still presumably preserving the compositions of Wang Wei's painting. And then Guo Zhongshu's painting was engraved in stone, and the stone engravings lasted through centuries and were very much imitated, copied, used for recreating the painting, so to speak, afterwards. So, anyway, they're among the little that we have that can really be attached in any way to Wang Wei. Wang Wei as a painter was not really rated all that high by Tang critics, but he was raised to the very highest level later. He's said to have used ink-monochrome in painting landscape, and he used something called palmo, or broken ink style. Palmo, not splashed ink, was very different. Japanese is the difference between Hatsuboku, splashed ink, and Haboku, broken ink. We don't know exactly what it meant, but it was some innovation that made ink monochrome painting more interesting and so on. Nothing, as I say, really survives to testify about what broken ink painting really was, some new development that allowed ink monochrome painting to become more exciting, more interesting, more visually whatever than it otherwise was. Wang Wei is credited later, and I talked about Dongqi Chang earlier, who made up this art historical idea of the northern and southern schools, with the northern school of professionals and careful painters, technically high-level painters like Li Shishun, and Li Jiaodao, his son, as the founders of the northern school, and then Wang Wei is put in as the founder of the southern school, and that gives him a great prestige in China. The southern school is made up in large part of those artists that the literati painters like Dongqi Chang valued, painters who are themselves cultivated people, educated people, and so on, not just professional painters. The great Su Dongpo of the 11th century, whom we'll talk a lot about when we come to the beginnings of literati painting, so-called, Su Dongpo even ranked Wang Wei above the great Wu Daozi. He wrote in a poem, quote, "Though Master Wu Daozi was supreme in art, he can only be regarded as an artisan painter. Wang Wei soared beyond images, like an immortal crane released from the cage," end quote. Well, we don't know what underlies this judgment. We can't know what Su Shi saw and knew of Wu and Wang. It may not have been all that much more than we do, because not much of them was preserved by that time. But maybe it's only the beginnings, that is, of the literati bias that somewhat poisons painting theory and criticism in later times by limiting it mainly to the opinions of the literati. In other words, all the writing we have is by the literati, and they favored very much the people of their own class. The paintings by men of literary cultivation and men who were necessarily superior. So their work was better than the work of the artisan painters, as they eventually came to call them. In any case, Wang Wei was the ideal combination of attributes. He was a poet, calligrapher, painting, and something of a statesman. I mean, he had some part in the government. Nothing of his work as a painter survives except in distant and things of questionable reliability. And here we see an ink rubbing. I'll show several of them. The whole bunch are reproduced in the 3,000 Years book, but illegibly. You can't really read them at all, just a bit of blur. At any rate, stone engravings made after I guess it was a 10th or 11th century artist's copy of Wang Wei's series of paintings he did of his villa and its surroundings, the Wang Chuan Tu. Originally, there were wall paintings, and as I say, were copied shortly after his time, and the copies were preserved and then eventually engraved and so on. Here's one section of it, and you see his house surrounded by trees, leafy trees. Well, we try to imagine now a Tang painting behind this, and it's not too difficult. The very variegated types of trees with all the leafage shown carefully distinguished, the rocks and mountains done with repeated outlines. And here, of course, in a stone engraving, you cannot have washes. You can't have graded washes, so you have to use these little flecks of, as if flecks of ink, actually little dents in the stone, to reproduce the shading from one line to the next. But and then all of these used to surround objects and create spaces. In this case, it's Wang Wei's villa, the Wang Chuan villa proper, surrounded. There's water around it, and then hills. Okay, you can imagine, as I say, a Tang painting distantly behind this. The next, please. Here's the next. Near the villa was the remains, the ruins of an old villa or some kind of building anyway, which had a wall around it. And these ruins were, anyway, kind of, I guess, something that inspired poetic thoughts and thoughts of the past and so on. So they appear always in the Wong Wei's painting of the surroundings of his Wong Chuan villa, and distinguish this kind of scroll, which we see, as I say, many times. Otherwise, again, a row of a ridge at the right with repeated outlines and shading from one to another, and then many, many trees of different kinds of foliage, and labels up above identifying the scenes. Let's see, the next, please. Here is the third of these further on. Another picture of a house where Wong Wei stayed, and closer up, pine trees and other trees. And here you can see closer up what must have been in the original, presumably was in the original, shading, shaded wash from one to the next, presumably somehow exemplifying this quality of Paul Ma. Okay, this is mysterious. We can't do more than talk about it. Here you see figures inside the house, by the way, so it's brought up closer and a bit more of the narrative or anecdotal. And the same way with the trees, large trees. Okay, then what else do we have to show of Wong Wei? Not very much. Here, next one. There are many, many, probably hundreds of copies from this series of compositions called the Wong Chuan Tu. Some of them purporting to be Wong Wei's original. The Chinese are very free about making attributions even when they're obviously implausible. And some of them acknowledged as by later artists or attributed to Guo Zhengshu, who made the copy or whatever. At any rate, there, as I say, just lots and lots of these. My poor friend, close friend, and very much respected friend, Kohara Hironobu, had to write a whole book on Wong Wei, a whole book of reproductions and text on Wong Wei. He edited a series called Bunjin Ga Suihen on Wanrenhua, a literati painting, for a Tokyo publisher, Chuo Koronsha. There was one series of 10 volumes on Japanese Bunjin Ga and one on 10 volumes on Chinese Wanrenhua. And Kohara farmed out the other volumes, all to friends of his. I ended up writing one on 19th, 20th century painting. Dick Barnhart wrote one on Sung painting and so on, landscape. Poor Kohara, by farming out the best of them to others, was left with Wong Wei all for himself, and there wasn't really much to reproduce except these endless reproductions of scrolls attributed to him of the Wong Chuan Villa. He had a few other things, but there are not much. Anyway, it's a good book, but I don't envy him the task of having to write about Wong Wei. There's not much there. Here, next, please. Here's another of the another section, I think probably from Kohara's book, of another of these scrolls. And always they show the Wong Chuan Villa, the buildings itself, quite splendid, surrounded by a wall, and then to the left, the old remains of a nearby compound of some kind with a wall around it. Okay. Now, enough for that. Now here, next please. This, taken from a reproduction, I've never seen the original. This is called a painting, an album leaf painting attributed to Wong Wei, titled Boat on a Snowy River. And there's a piece of writing here in the upper right, probably meant for the Emperor Huizong. I've never seen this because it's in a lost mixed album, that is, an album made up of leaves by various artists, and it was in the Manchu Imperial collection, and then it disappeared. It was reproduced in a reproduction book, and then it disappeared. So far as I know, it's never turned up. If anybody knows where it is, please write me. Please tell me. And it's reproduced in Suren's book and in Sullivan's book and various others. It's supposed to represent Wong Wei's graded wash technique and a snowy scene with boats on the river, and indeed what seems to be something of repeated outlines and shading. And if we believed it, it would be indeed valuable information on Wong Wei style, but there's no way to tell just how old it is or just how close to Wong Wei it is. We can't even see the painting. As I say, if anybody knows where it is, please tell me. The next, please. This one we can see, but it's not so, as far as I can tell, not so old or so important as some take it to be. This is attributed to Wong Wei, clearing after snowfall along the river. This is a section of a hand scroll in the Ogawa collection, a private collection in Kyoto, reproduced in Suren and Lur and others. Another version of it, by the way, which was handled by Luo Zhonyu, sold in Japan, is now in the Honolulu Academy of Arts. Same composition, different version. Many old paintings exist in several versions, copies. This was a painting that was much appreciated by this late Ming critic theorist named Dong Chi-chang, whom I've talked about. He copied it or used it, or a version of it, whether or not this is the same as the Ogawa painting is unclear, and took it as reflecting the real style of Wong Wei, and learned a lot from it. You can almost see beginnings of some Dong Chi-chang, if you know that artist, in this painting. My colleague Wong wrote an article, a long article on it. He takes it much more seriously than I do also. It doesn't seem to me really earlier than late Ming in maybe after a Sung original. Not really so old, maybe when Dong Chi-chang saw it. At any rate, I don't take it as real evidence for the way Wong Wei painted. But let me insert here a brief look at how Dong Chi-chang made use of this painting, or another version of it, in his own works. Here beside the section of the Ogawa hand scroll is a section of a hand scroll that Dong Chi-chang painted in 1603, which he inscribes as being, quote, after Guo Zhongshu. But that early Sung artist, Guo Zhongshu, was believed to have followed Wong Wei, so he really means Wong Wei. And next, please. Here's the whole of the landscape that Dong Chi-chang painted, this time acknowledging it as in the manner of Wong Wei, in 1621. And next, please. Here's the upper part of that painting. The resemblance is really very close. A kind of unnatural formalization that in the so-called Wong Wei scroll was a matter of the forger's heavy-handedness, becomes in Dong Chi-chang's work a deliberate and artistically effective kind of abstraction. That's very interesting. Now, back to the works ascribed to Wong Wei. The next, please. Okay. Now, here's a Buddhist painting. I said I wasn't going to talk about Buddhist painting. What is this one doing here? Well, because it has landscapes in it, and we're talking about Tang landscape. We don't have much to show, so this is an important example. This is the so-called Hokke mandala. That's a Japanese term. It's a great and famous painting now in the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. It came from Japan. Some Japanese have claimed it as a Japanese painting, but most people still, I think, see it as Chinese, and 8th or 9th century in date. That is a real Tang painting, genuine Tang painting, in the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, as I say. And it represents the Buddha preaching his great sermon on the Vulture Peak, a story that comes from the Lotus Sutra, the most popular of the Buddhist sutras or texts in the Far East, or in East Asia, I should say, in which the historical Buddha, Shakyamuni, lays out the grand plan of the universe, according to Mahayana, the greater vehicle form of Buddhism. Well, that's all for Buddhism, which I'm not talking about. But what is important for us is that this great painting has on the sides, to the right and left of the Buddha, very dimly seen here, landscapes, because he is preaching the sermon outdoors on the Vulture Peak. And then to the left and right of him, you see views into the distance through ravines between cliffs and so on. Now, next, please. The Boston Museum of Fine Arts in the old days actually made infrared photographs of these background landscapes, which are reproduced in an old folio of plates by the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. And these are of considerable value. They're just about invisible in the original, but with infrared photography, they come out fairly clearly. That is, as clearly as they can. They're not really highly well-organized landscapes, or at least they don't look that way, but you can see quite a lot in them. And they have, for instance, the same kind of cliffs and receding views over the river, and trees growing from cliffs, flat-topped ledges, and repeated outlines with shading from dark to light, from one outline to the next. So this is an example, a real example, of ink-monochrome landscape from the Tang period. We have one. We wish we had one that was rather clearer, but anyway, here it is. In the upper right, by the way, you see between two cliffs what seems to be a winding river going back at a distance. This is a little bit like the Shoso-in Biwa landscape that I showed at the beginning, and again, a genuine work from the Tang period. Trees, it's a kind of bleak landscape. This is much closer to the way landscape is going to develop in the future. That is, as we'll see it in the succeeding lectures. We see paths going around forms, so as to suggest the other side, as though you can move around them. Trees that are twisted in grotesque shapes, and a kind of bleak grandeur, a quality that's much sought in early Chinese ink landscape painting. Here, next please, the other side. It's not terribly clear, but it's clear enough, and there are parts of it you can make out quite clearly. And as I say, it's very valuable as testifying to ink-monochrome landscape from the Tang Dynasty. Maybe Wong made some kind of stylistic innovations that helped to open the way for this kind of landscape. We can't really say. Well, this was a topic of, by the way, the first dissertation completed under Wong at Princeton. That is the dissertation by Kyo, or properly Kiyohiko, Munakata. Munakata sensei, who went on to, he taught at the University of Illinois at Champaign, Urbana-Champaign, for years, and then also published an annotated translation of an important essay attributed to a great 10th century master named Jing Hao. And I'll talk about it when we come to it. That's a major publication of his. I was a reader of his dissertation and a good friend anyway, I hope. He retired, then went back to Japan, died of illness there. And he used this painting and these Boston Museum photographs very heavily in his dissertation, which was on the beginnings of ink monochrome landscape in the Tang Dynasty. The beginning, the earliest stages, that is, of ink monochrome landscape at all. Okay, the next, please. Now, the last slide for today's lecture is another fragment. We've seen several before. Fragment from Central Asia, from a Buddhist banner found at a Central Asian site, belonging again to the 8th or 9th century in date. It's reproduced in the 3,000 Years book, figure 80. And it represents, as you see, pine and cypress trees with a really strong sense of growth, sense of survival under harsh circumstances. We'll see a whole school of landscape paintings that pursues this aspect of nature, located physically in the northeast of China and featuring Li Changguoxi, great artists. But also, there's some sense of brush movement here, of curling, slightly hooked strokes for the twigs, and the shading of the trunks for cylindricality. Now, this suggests, again, the new direction that landscape is going to take, along with the landscapes of the Hokke mandala we just saw. Instead of color, it's ink monochrome. Instead of visual beauty, something that's harsher, stronger. Instead of lush scenery, something that's bleaker, emphasizing the difficulty of survival under harsh conditions in nature. Well, we'll see the landscape that follows this new direction developing in the centuries afterwards, the 5 dynasties and the Northern Sung periods, the 10th, 11th, into the 12th centuries. But 10th and 11th, for Northern Sung. Artists of that period are collectively working to find brushstroke equivalents, you might say, for materials in nature, that is, for tree branches and twigs, the textures of rocks and hillsides and so on, how you can render these in ways that convey the the appearances of those things, enough for the artist's purposes, while also conveying the sense of growth and change in nature, in the great landscape of the world, and this grand coherence within the great organic world that is their subject, that becomes the subject of landscape painting. All of this through brilliantly varied but controlled brushwork, the development of ink-monochrome, development of brush idioms for rendering, as I say, natural forms. Before we get to that, however, there'll be a lecture on other kinds of 5 dynasties painting, which will be lecture 5 that follows this one.